A.C. Grayling, a name synonymous with intellectual depth and clarity, is a British philosopher, author and humanist who has dedicated his life to exploring the big questions of existence. Born in 1949 in Zambia, Grayling's childhood in Africa instilled in him a curiosity about the world and a respect for diverse perspectives. This curiosity blossomed into a passion for philosophy, leading him to Oxford and eventually a prestigious professorship at Birkbeck, University of London. Here is a Newsfirst exclusive with A.C. Grayling.
Professor Grayling, it's a pleasure to have you with us here in Sri Lanka, here at the Golf Fort, and here on TV1. Let me start with a very, very simple question. What is philosophy?
Well, firstly, let me say thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted to be in Gaul. It's fascinating and wonderful. Wonderful, friendly, warm people. I felt very, very welcome here. What is philosophy? The dictionary definition says that it is the love of wisdom, but we all love wisdom, so that's not very helpful. What it really means, it means disciplined inquiry, trying to dig down into a real understanding of ideas and of the assumptions that sometimes lie buried very deep beneath the way we think and act. So it is an attempt to make sense, to understand, because understanding is the great step that comes even after knowledge. You have knowledge, but you need to understand what you know.
But why? Why philosophy? Why understand knowledge? Is knowledge itself an end rather than a means?
Well, it's certainly an end in many respects, because after all, we've set ourselves the goal of trying to get the information and organize the information, and that's what knowledge is. Knowledge is more than just data. Until you put the data into relationships and patterns, you don't have knowledge. I mean, you've got knowledge. But then how do you apply that knowledge? How do you use it? What does it really mean? What difference does it make to us? Which knowledge, like, for example, how to make nuclear weapons, should we not use, and so on. And so the philosophical quest is for that further step, which helps us to really make sense and to make good use of what we know.
So how then do you reconcile the different philosophical bents that you can arrive at? You can arrive at one, I can arrive at another. How do you reconcile with all of these different ends, as it were?
Right, so there are two different ways in which there can be a diversity of views. One is that there can be many different perspectives based on a good deal of commonality. So we agree, for example, that there's some problem in our state or democracy or society, and we can have different solutions, right wing, left wing, and we can have a discussion about them. So that's one form of disagreement. And that kind of disagreement is actually quite useful, because by bouncing off each other, criticizing each other's ideas, learning from each other, we could find some commonality or some way of arriving at a new synthesis of our ideas, a bit like the dialectic, you know, the thesis, the antithesis, and so on. The other kind of diversity is what people often describe as relativism. Your good is your good, I think your good is bad, you think my good is bad, and so on. How are we going to overcome this? And that is more difficult. Sometimes there are absolutely irreconcilable differences, and that could be one of the reasons why the world is a place of conflict. But generally speaking, the problem of relativism is created artificially by misunderstanding, by using the same word in two different meanings, by unclarity, by not... Well, so for example, we could think of the term democracy, for example. The People's Democracy of North Korea is one kind of democracy, and Sri Lankan democracy is another, US democracy. So you can think of different varieties. And people think they're using the same concept, and actually they're applying it very differently or understanding it differently. And in order to deal with that kind of relativism, you have to dig and dig and dig deeper and deeper until you try to arrive at some point that you can agree on and see if you can rebuild from there. But it's difficult. There's no suggestion here that it's easy to overcome relativities, but it is certainly a duty to try our best to overcome them.
So what problem is philosophy trying to overcome here? Is it the problem of life? Is it the problem of living? A purposeful living? What is it exactly?
Well, all those three things hang together, don't they? The problem of life Who am I? What am I? Are there extrinsic or external purposes or aims or goals, or am I responsible for creating them? The answers we give to these questions are the answers that come from the philosophical endeavor, the philosophical exploration. In a way, there's a cartoon in a New Yorker magazine which I really like, and it shows two men walking along, and there's a big sign on the wall, and the sign says, "Think." And one of the men says to the other man, he says, "Makes you think, doesn't it?" So, in the end, philosophy is about thinking, because surprisingly, when you really dig into something, you find there are all sorts of aspects or dimensions to it that were not obvious on the surface, and that when you do see them, they make a real difference to how you see the world.
So philosophy, in a sense, is a higher level of understanding, but is it in then direct contrast and conflict with nature, or is it in harmony with nature?
Oh, I think the latter, actually, because as soon as one begins to put oneself into context, the context of relationship with other people, with society in general, and with the world that we inhabit. So you could see that there would be a very good kind of wokeism, which tells us that if I have a responsibility to myself to think about what would be a good and worthwhile life, and I see that this involves having good relationships with others and responsibility to others, and I see that this says something about society and politics, then I also see that it is about the world that we inhabit. This is our home, and we have responsibilities to it. Let me give you a more precise way of thinking about that, which is there are in our moral activity, there are agents, so people, companies, governments, who act and have effects on other people and on the world. These are agents, actors. And then there are what you might call patients. These are the people who receive. They are on the passive end. They receive the activity of the agents and patients. Now, all agents are patients also. Yes. So both agent and patient. But there are many, many things which are only patients. A baby, a rabbit, a chicken, a tree. They are patients because they can be affected by how we act. But patients belong to the moral universe as well as agents. And this is why, as soon as you see this, as soon as you realize what the network, the connection is, the framework, then you begin to see, when I realize that I have responsibilities as an actor, those responsibilities apply to other agents and to all patients as well.
So, politics is
dirty word.
Is it though?
Well, I'm afraid in too many cases it becomes so. I think, again, if we take an historical perspective, we see that Plato said in Book 8 of the Republic, he said democracy is a terrible thing, because he thought that democracy is the same thing as ochlocracy. That's a great word, ochlocracy. It means rule by the mob. Okay. And so he said, no, we don't want that. We need philosophers to be in charge. And as I say, I agree with that. Okay, and for many, 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 many centuries, because the great authority of Plato in the Western tradition said democracy is bad, nobody tried democracy. Anyway, the people in power, the people with the wealth, the kings and the barons, the aristocracy, they didn't want other people to have any say. But from the late 17th century, there was a new thought, well, middle 17th century really, from the time of the revolution in England and then later the revolution in France, America. People thought, look, human beings have a right to a say. They have a right to a voice. If you're going to live under law, you should help to choose what the laws are. So that is a right. But people also have another right. And this other right is a right to good enough government. Good enough government. Now, nothing outside Gaul thought is perfect in our world. So we're not going to get a perfect government, okay? So good enough government. And actually that phrase is a phrase from Aristotle, good enough government. Right. So to get from having a right to a say to good enough government without the right becoming mob rule, how are you going to do it? by good institutions, by good laws. In fact, this was something that was seen a long time ago. Livy, the Roman writer of the history of Rome, he said, when the Romans kicked out the kings, the Tarquins, the arrogant kings, we took law and put it in the place of men. And so we have a society which is ruled by law. Good institutions will take the right of people into a good enough government.
Yeah.
But, sorry to go on too long,
No,
but, excuse me, careerism, professional politicians, people who begin to see how you can move the levers of the institutions to make it serve them or their party. Now you think in too many democracies in the world, like the UK democracy, US democracy, the Indian democracy, the problem there is that the electoral system, first past the post plurality voting, it creates two parties. Yeah. And the third parties and other parties have very little influence. So when you have two parties, they compete with one another for the levers of power. And between elections, if one wins a majority, then between elections you have a one-party state. And that party represents the interests of one section of society. But you know, Abraham Lincoln said, democracy is government of the people, by the people, for the people. And the word in the first sentence and in the third sentence, the people means everybody. Of course, in the second sentence, in 19th century America, it meant white men who have property. Because they only had the vote, okay? So by the people, that's them. But for the people, that's for everybody. But a true democracy should be by everybody, for everybody. Therefore, government should not be political. This is what I say in one of my books about democracy. I say, of course, we need politics. We need to discuss and to argue and to have different opinions and to try to formulate some consensus. But when we have government, that should be for everybody, and it should have a duty to respect the interests and needs of everybody.
So is that a government of bureaucrats? Is that what you're advocating?
Not really, no, although in some ways I think when I look at today's UK or the possibility of another Trump America, give me the bureaucrats any time, you know. Sure. But I don't really mean that. Now, I think I mean consensus. So if you look at democracies...
So that's also politics.
Well, yes, but the kind of politics which is constrained. So think of like this. Supposing you had a proportional system of representation, and so you get multi-parties, you know, because there's a big diversity of opinion and choice in the society. So a number of political parties have proportions of the vote. To form a government, they have to have coalitions. So they have to discuss, they have to agree, well, you can't have that policy, but if we can agree on this policy, we can do this, okay? In the Netherlands, it usually takes them about 9 months from an election to have a government. Some people say, oh, this is terrible. I say, no, it's good because they're really discussing how they're going to have a government for everybody. But in addition to that, you need a good constitution. And the constitution will say, this is the duty of government. The government must do this. It must make sure that the least well-off in society are the most advantaged by our arrangements. That's John Rawls' principle of justice. Okay? And also it must specify the duties, the powers, and the limitation on the powers of both elected and appointed officials. So, and it's very, very clear what the remedy is if they act ultra vires, as they say. So these are very important institutional arrangements to constrain what people do, because if you give people power, as we know, they will want more and more, and then they'll start behaving badly. So we have to constrain that. Another example would be politics is not a career. You can be in Parliament for 1 term or for 5 years or a limit, and then you're not the creature of your political party doing what they say. You represent the party line instead of the people, and so on. So there are lots of ways you can make democracy work. It's never going to be perfect, but it can be a lot better.
So the pursuit of a Marcus Aurelius type of politician is really unrealistic?
Not necessarily. I mean, there have in the past been great examples, and you've cited one, Marcus Aurelius. In fact, the Antonines, which is the dynasty of emperors of which he was part, they provided the last great period of the Roman Empire, a good period. good laws, justly applied. Justice is so important in society because you look at our world today and what do we see? We see huge inequality, massive injustice, most of the world's wealth in very few hands, so much suffering and deprivation in the world. There is not a problem about the amount of wealth in the world, there's a problem with distribution, and this is a problem of justice. So justice is absolutely key to political morality, and you're only going to get it if you can make sure that individuals cannot manipulate the system in their own benefit. Political careerism, the kinds of laws that favour the accumulation of wealth, these are things that need to be carefully looked at.
So do you think that democracy in that sense is in sort of decay today?
Today it's in danger. I think there are two outstanding examples of how it's gone wrong in the first past the post voting system. One is Brexit and the other is Trump. In Europe, most of the EU countries, or all of them, in fact, have proportional representation systems. And even though the newspapers are always, wanting to have conflicts between politicians and disagreements and people leaving the coalition and whatever, because it sells, news and so on. If you look at the record, their economies and their social cohesion, social order, is by all metrics better. Nothing is ever perfect. You can't have perfection in the human world, but it is a lot better than in the US. I mean, there are parts of the US which are worse than third world countries because of the inequality and the injustice there.
So just going back to what you said earlier about political morality, I guess what I'm trying to get at is the responsibility of politics. Once you are in government, then your responsibility to the people that you are governing by the people and then for the people. So I suppose the moral and legal link between these two parties would be the social contract.
Yes.
And how important is the social contract in your views?
Oh, the social contract is incredibly important. It operates on a number of different levels. One, of course, is between those institutions in society which are accorded authority to help organize and deal with problems in society, policing, security, redistribution of wealth, provision of fundamentals which provide some degree of justice, like education and health and so on. So yes, absolutely vital. But also, of course, the responsibility on the part of voters to make good choices about who they elect to go to Parliament, and to be aware and alert, to follow what's happening and to understand what's happening in their society. And I'm afraid in the very populous democracies, it's very hard to get the voting population to be well informed. That was Plato's problem. If you put power in the hands of the ordinary people, they are selfish, they're self-interested, they're short-termist, they're egoistical, they're not bothered about people who live in the next town and so on. And this is the problem, which is why you have to have the institutions which will parlay, which will take all the different views and put them into something that will be optimal. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be optimal for the government of society as a whole. But that is only going to work if the people, given the duty, I mean, people forget. We think our rulers, the Prime Minister, the President, the government, our rulers. No, they are our servants. They should be really trying to understand what the people, the country's best interest is, not theirs. They have to be as indifferent, not uninterested, but disinterested and neutral as possible in order to try to favour everybody. This is utopian, of course, which is why you need institutions to constrain them.
Yeah, fair enough, but then the hold on power is then directly opposed to what you're saying in a sense, Professor, because you let go of the hold on power, then even if your intentions might be in the best interests of the people, if you don't have power, then you can't make it happen, you can't make it a reality. So then, is it then almost justified for a ruler to do all he or she can to retain his or her hold on power?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I appreciate the point, and the point you're making is very similar to, again, to cite the Romans. At times of great crisis, the Romans appointed a dictator, which literally means somebody who will say what's going to be done, a general. So they're in great danger, the state, they've been invaded by Hannibal, so they appointed a dictator, Fabius, the Fabian. And so one can kind of understand that in circumstances where that is necessary. But of course it's perilous, it's dangerous to do that, to put power, unbridled power, into any one person's hands. This is the problem with Hobbes. Hobbes, the absolute sovereign, against whom there is no remedy, no redress, unless he doesn't act keep the security of the people. But no, I think the thing about a democratic order is that, I keep saying, not perfect, that the people in a democratic order have to accept the imperfections. Let me give you a parallel, okay? Some people say that it is the major duty of government, I say it is a high duty but not the main duty, to keep the people secure against terrorism, against crime, against the threat of external aggression. So security is a high duty of government, the security of the people. Now, how can you best achieve that? Easy. Lock everybody in their houses and never let them out. If you're going to let them out and catch a bus and go on the street and go shopping and so on, you put them in danger. Traffic accident, terrorist incident, something like that. So you say to the people, the risk is the price of freedom. Absolute security, no risk, except from your wife and husband. We lock you in the house. Which do you want? Well, then people realize that you have to accept the bad aspect in order to really benefit from the good aspect. So your liberty and your security are trade-offs. Now, Benjamin Franklin said, people who prefer security over liberty deserve neither. And he's right. And in fact, in my view, it's the Lord Acton, not that I'm in the same politics as Lord Acton, but he was right to say that liberty is the most precious political and social commodity, and that the first duty of government should be to protect liberties, which is an interesting idea, because to protect the liberty of the people, you have to empower people to use their liberty. You can't say to a poor person who has no money and no food, oh, well, you're free. Free to what? Starve to death, So to protect the liberties of the people is to protect their interests in other respects as well.
And what does that entail? What does it mean to protect somebody's liberty? Is that individual liberty? What if that individual liberty is at odds with liberty of society?
Oh, well, there is, again, this is Isaiah Berlin. So Isaiah Berlin always pointed out that your liberty and my liberty come into conflict sometimes. So we have to recognize that individual liberty must be under the government of mutual concern. So we think about the interests of society as one in which, as individuals, we must, in a mature and responsible way, yield up some part of personal sovereignty in the interests of all, of the sort of optimal arrangement of sovereignty for other individuals as well. It is a trade-off, there's no question. Again, nothing's going to be perfect. In fact, if you accord, think about the United States of America and the libertarian movement. Now, libertarianism is not the same thing as liberty. Libertarianism is the freedom to tread on other people's heads and take their money and stamp on them and have guns and shoot people with them and so on. That's libertarianism. And libertarianism is very anti-liberty because it deprives other people of their liberty. So we've got to find that balance. There's got to be struck. There's got to be a negotiation. And the point of good politics, responsible politics, is the continual negotiation and renegotiation of the balance of these things in society. How we share the social goods, wealth, education, health, and so on, how we distribute those fairly, how we prevent too much accumulation in a few hands, creating great inequality. Because even on pragmatic grounds, great inequality in a society is incredibly destabilizing. When it goes too far, there's a revolution. Because the people at the bottom are going to get really fed up eventually. They're going to see that it's unjust. So you have to have some kind of continual negotiation and renegotiation to work this balance. It's like being on a ship at sea.
Okay, so let's talk about good politics for a bit.
Yes.
So good politics in itself, does it require philosophy? that space?
Yes, absolutely.
So politicians should be philosophers?
Yes, politics needs a philosophy, or an aspect of philosophy, which is ethical and moral thinking. And I distinguish between these two things. They're not exactly the same thing. The ethical question is about the good of society and the good of individual lives in that society and what the relationship is. Now, Aristotle thought that his work on ethics and his work on politics were continuous. They were one work. It's only possible to have good individual lives in a good society. Therefore, you need to try and understand what a good society is. Right. The question is the question about not just the principles, the fundamental ideas of justice, of justice as fairness in society, and of those social goods which enhance the possibility of good lives for individuals. Now, when I normally talk about these things, I say the sort of Socratic view is that each individual person has to make and choose a good life for themselves. So this means that society must open a space around each individual to make those choices in ways that are under that individual's responsibility. That individual must respect the same right for other people. Sometimes this doesn't happen because there is conflict and disagreement, and therefore at the social level there has to be a way of adjusting and adjudicating and resolving disputes. This is why I have law and courts and so on. So, it's a layered, structured and complex thing, but it has to be thought about. So we began by saying what philosophy is about: making sense and understanding. It's about seeing the whole picture, all of it, but clearly. Not just the whole picture as one big picture, but seeing all the details in it as well. And a great statesman or a great stateswoman will have two characteristics. The first is that it's not about them. It's not a personal ego thing, not trying to be rich or famous or look at me. It's about somebody who is genuinely dedicated to the public good, as we say. And the second thing is a clear-minded, non-partisan, unideological conception of what the general good is. Now, the trouble with party politics is that there's a party view about what the public good is, which means they're good. And I would recommend to anybody watching this program to go on the internet straight afterwards and say, and look up Federalist Papers. Look up the Federalist Paper number 10 by James Madison, and it's on factionalism, by which he means party politics. Right. And he says in there, the great danger to democracy is factionalism, where you get parties are forming, and they serve the capitalists and they serve the workers, and when they get into power, everything is distorted in the direction of one. They get into power, everything's distorted there. And this means that the society is going to be a continual site of warfare, of political, social, economic warfare between the factions. Which is why I say in my book about the nature of the good state, I say government must transcend politics. I agree, it's a little bit utopian and so on, but if you really were looking for the optimal, nobody's fool enough to look for the ideal. The optimal is as close as you can get to the ideal, and that would be it.
Professor Grayling, I could keep you here all day, but I've been told by my colleagues to wrap things up, so unfortunately we have to end things here. But thank you for being in Sri Lanka, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm certain it's going to inspire many young lives and hopefully bring good change to Sri Lanka and whoever's watching this program.
Thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
As a prolific writer, Grayling has penned over 30 books on a vast array of subjects, from ethics and logic to the history of ideas and the meaning of life. His works are characterized by their accessible language, thought-provoking arguments, and unwavering commitment to reason and evidence.